Good day once again. This is lecture 19. We just have one more lecture after this, and we're addressing the issue of postmodernism. We're really at the end of the program. Very often you would have heard the term postmodern mind, the postmodern age, the postmodern child, sometimes when you're discussing radical cultural differences between the generations. It's a term that has become very popular and in fact very often misused and not given the right connotations or the right denotation. But the word postmodern has come to characterize very much of the culture of the late 20th and now early 21st century. It's a strange term. The term post attached to modern is a very strange thing because modern refers to the contemporary. Right? When we talk about the modern world, we're really talking about the contemporary world to a large extent. And nothing can temporarily be after what is not contemporary unless we are involved in reflections on the future, futuristic reflections. Postmodernism is not about the future, right? But it responds to modernism in a very critical way. And the whole modernism conceived not just in temporal terms, but in cultural, civilizational terms. Modernism defines Western society and Western culture over the last, say, 2 centuries. So post is in a way a kind of philosophical reflection, critical reflection that is, of all that constitutes what has been defined as modernity or modernism. Now, the word post really is used and attached to a number of different terms. People refer to post-Marxists. People refer to post-feminists. You can attach post to everything. Very often, Western European society is now referred to as a post-Christian society. It's no longer Christian, right? The post does suggest a certain kind of rejection, disagreement, right? A break in the historical process and the arrival of a new kind of age, a new kind of thinking. So the word post, in fact, it's overused and it's used in reference to a number of things. And when we come towards the end of this discussion, I'll be referring to post-humanism, right? That which exists after humanism or after the human. So the word post has been is a term that really has been overused, but you cannot escape it. The postmodernism very often is also referred to as post-structuralism. A few lectures ago, I talked about structuralism. I didn't place too much emphasis on it, but just to remind you, structuralism really was a mode of thinking characteristic of the modern consciousness in which people perceive structures in all aspects of human culture, all human productions, right? There were structures in our thought systems, in our worldviews, and many of these structures point back to perhaps Kantian structures, categories of mind that Kant had referred us to, right? That very often, I mean, when we're talking about structuralism, I mentioned Levi-Strauss and the notion of binaries, right? Hierarchical binaries that always characterizes human thinking, like black and white, tall and short, male and female, first world and third world, right? You always have these interesting binaries. And when you see things in binary terms, one is always superior to the next. We can't see them as enjoying a certain kind of status of equality. So structuralism, the post-structuralists were people who clearly would have rejected many of the notions of the existence of structure inherent in human products, cultural or technological. right? So that clearly we are dealing with a whole new body of ideas, and a body of ideas that has come to be very critical of so much that we have been discussing recently when we started with Descartes and continued right down to the end of the Enlightenment period. Also, the postmodern age is very often seen as a post-Enlightenment age, right? An age after the Enlightenment. There's another thing captured in the notion of post, and that is the sense of paradox or irony or fundamental contradiction, right? There's a sense in which our age cannot escape, and we will see it in the last lecture in the area of theology, that our age cannot escape the existence of contradiction. I remember that Hegel is the one who has introduced us to the notion of contradiction. Kierkegaard, the sense of either or, the coexistence of either or, one does not exclude the other, but both share, right, in the occupancy of this period or this point in time and space. So that the notion of post captures the notion of contradiction, of paradox, right? The notion of irony. Very often we are simultaneously saying something and not saying something. And we'll see that how that plays out in the very first individual that we will be dealing with. Now, what about modernity was postmodernism so concerned about, so angry about, and resisted so stoutly? It was modernity's sense of the inevitability of human progress, the sense that human beings are engaged in history. We are the ones who create history. Right? Long ago was lost the notion that history essentially is in the hands of God. Remember that it was an Augustinian view. It was a Jewish view, essentially, originally, that God manifested himself in Jewish history, not in all human history necessarily until the time of Isaiah, but he manifested himself in Jewish history. He saved them from Babylon, from Egyptian captivity and so on. He brought them into the new land. He gave them victory over the Canaanites and so on. He was seen in history. Whereas for most other people, God was seen in nature. And then it came to be appropriated by the medieval, in the medieval period, with the Christian worldview that was dominant, and Augustine gave a certain sort of solidity to that. So that history was in a way the playground of God. And that is captured again, even within the Enlightenment period in Hegelian philosophy. But the notion of history is a very humanistic one now. History is the creation of man. Yes, we can consider nature to be the creation of God if we wish. But in terms of history, that is his story, our story as human beings. And so that history has been seen over the years when we look from the time of the Renaissance period, Descartes and Bacon and so on. We see a sense that human beings have moved forward, that we have learned from the past, that we can now solve the problems of the past, especially after the great scientific revolution that Galileo and Newton had initiated. There was a sense that we were really moving forward, and we were extending, or not only our control over our human world, but we were extending our control and mastery of the external natural world. And that progress would continue indefinitely. It may not initially include everyone. It certainly for Western Europeans didn't initially include the subject peoples within the empire. But in the end, they themselves, right, would learn and would be benefited by that movement of history. So that history in itself was a sphere of human agency. It clearly was marked by the inevitability of change and progress. And there was a sense that within that could be perceived the possibility of man's perfectibility, that we could perfect our human existence, that we could become virtually perfect beings, solving not only our external problems, but even problems that were internal, problems of mind. There was increasing scientific knowledge, a better knowledge of our environment, gave us the capacity to manipulate and control that environment. When we understood the laws of nature, we could now control nature itself and determine the progress, even of what was described as evolution, biological evolution. That notion, that basic humanistic confidence in man's capacity has not completely perished. We still continue, right, to cherish and to build our civilization on those fundamental values and insights. But the fact is that at this point in time, a number of thinkers were questioning that. And they were questioning that because of a number of very significant historical incidents. And again, I would have referred to some of them before, right? There was the tremendous rise and prosperity of Western Europe with the Industrial Revolution, the technological progress that was made and so on. We have moved from steam engines to electricity, the second industrial revolution, right? And then we were moving forward. And today, right now we're experiencing what is regarded as the fourth industrial revolution. We have moved to not only to the digital age, but we have moved to the time of AI, artificial intelligence, and robotics, and the biotechnologies that are certainly designed to solve many of our bodily problems or problems of health and physical well-being, and even problems of aging and so on. So clearly there is still that sense that man is making significant progress. But all of that came to be challenged around the turn of the last century, the end of the 1900s, the end of the 1800s, certainly the end of the 19th century, and the turn into the 20th century. Because that century was met, first of all, by the outbreak of a war that was the most calamitous event in all of human history, the First World War, where millions of people were destroyed, and the new technologies were the instruments of that destruction. Those same technologies that were intended to benefit mankind, those same technologies came to be the most devastating instruments of an internecine warfare between the Western European powers. Europe wasn't fighting the rest of the world. Europe was fighting among itself. The nations were fighting among themselves. And clearly, the devastations that brought had global implications, because these European nations were empires with territories in all parts of the world. There were Trinidadians who were recruited to go and fight in the First World War. And that was a tremendous experience for many of them, because when they came back with the intent of changing the politics of the day. So there was the First World War. That First World War was followed by a very serious period of economic depression, right? The Great Depression, all right, of the 1930s. And that Great Depression really showed how very vulnerable was man's capacity to create a civilization in which the well-being of all was guaranteed. It was the wealthy nations of the world, places like the United States of America and so on, that suffered perilously, right, during that period of the Great Depression. And then the Great Depression was followed by the Second World War, 1939 to 1945. So that first half of the 20th century was a period during which we witnessed some of the greatest calamities and disasters. What was so horrifying about the Second World War was not merely the massive scale of destruction in terms of buildings in Europe, in terms of the achievements of Western culture and civilization, in terms of human life, right? Not only was that, right, clearly an instantiation of horrifying disaster, but what we find also is that the confidence of the European, right, was shattered in his belief that he could bring about that state of human perfection. The Second World War also witnessed a moral flaw in human civilization that was previously inconceivable. And that moral flaw is constituted by the rise of Nazism in Germany, right? the Nazis were not one of the solutions to the problems that Germany was facing. It was felt by the Nazis on the Hitler, was to wipe out a whole race of people, right? Racism had reached its most severe and its most demonic proportions, right, in that Second World War. And the massive scale of destruction, the concentration camps, right, the machinery of war, right, the development of things like biological warfare and chemical warfare during that period, experimentations on subject peoples. The Germans experimented on Jews in the concentration camps, right, and the gas chambers. And then you also had its aftermath or its side effect in Russia, where Stalin, who was as brutal as Hitler, took over and began to destroy millions of his own people in order to preserve communism, which he felt was under threat from the West. So this was a period when people really began to question everything. I mean, that is one of the things that accounts for the rise of existentialism, right? And the turn towards interiority, the turn towards the individual psyche, and human life itself, to understand what it is that prompts man, what it is that is behind, right, this whole historical disaster deep within the human psyche. So postmodernism really raised those issues and raised those issues ferociously. And so the contemporary age is very often referred to as the age of postmodernism or post-structuralism. Now, I'm only going to be looking at three thinkers during that period. And the first one is a Frenchman, Jewish, but a Frenchman born in Algeria, but a Frenchman called Jacques Derrida. Derrida was one of the first men who began to really interrogate this whole question of Western humanism and the legacy of the Enlightenment. And he wrote a number of very interesting books, one called Of Grammatology, another one called Margins of Philosophy, in which he began to examine the nature of Western civilization and Western culture. In the book of Grammatology, he focuses primarily on language. What constitutes language? Most linguists or most language philosophers within the analytic tradition, as well as the Western European phenomenological tradition, right, began to see language in terms of the linguistics of Ferdinand de Saussure, that language really was a human construct that in no way really gave us a true insight into the nature of things, into noumena, into an understanding of the objective world. More and more people recognize that language was merely another tool that we use in order to navigate our reality, but does not necessarily give us a full insight into that reality. And when you look at language, what you find is that there is no fundamentally logical structure behind language. Yes, we express logic in linguistic terms. There's no real logical structure behind language. That to a large extent, there is something that seems to be very, indeterministic about the structure and the nature of language, about the creation of words, right? Language essentially, for Derrida, language is a system of difference. And I will talk a bit more about his notion of difference a little later on. But language is a system of difference. When we look at the phonetic structures, right, what determines the difference in meanings are very often phonetic differences, not lexical differences, right? Not differences in terms of meaning, but differences that are very arbitrary. There's a certain arbitrariness about language, arbitrariness about the signifier. He also juxtaposes the signified against the signifier. The signifier is the object before us that we are viewing and describing. The signifier is the word that is used. I mentioned it before when I was dealing with structuralism, but I will mention it again. The word tree in English has no relationship with the word arbol in Spanish or the word arbre in French. Absolutely no relationship, no connection, not even through onomatopoeia. That is, through the sound of the word is there any necessary connection between a tree as viewed by a Frenchman or a tree as viewed by an Englishman. So language is very arbitrary. The signifier is very arbitrary, right? This notion of language, and remember, I also mentioned that language was seen to be a godlike quality. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, right? That's from the book of John. That expresses a very powerful sense of the fact that language makes us human beings very godlike. We can communicate with him through prayer. We can communicate with each other. We can transfer thoughts. We are very much biologically like all the rest of the mammalian kingdom. It is language that separates us and allows us to occupy this very prestigious position within the scheme of things, within the chain of being. So language is extremely important. Language reflects the mind of God. God speaks to us. And in fact, Christ is actually the incarnation of the word. Right? That is the tradition of language that survived into even the Enlightenment period. That people saw language as, in primitive societies, very often language is seen as magical. You can perform magic with language, right? He spake and it was done, right? And that didn't only apply to God in the act of creation, it also applied to monarchs, right? When they speak, things happen. Buildings go up, roads are built, armies are mobilized, and so on, just by the speech of the monarch. And now people are saying, no, language is a very flimsy thing, right? There's a certain kind of flexibility, a certain kind of arbitrariness, right? A certain kind of almost meaninglessness that language has. And language is merely a tool that we use to navigate our reality. And one of the interesting things that Derrida pointed out was that all language is metaphorical. That's a very important point. So what he was doing here was that he was removing the distinction between literature on the one hand and philosophy on the other. Now, you remember when I corrected the first paper, we got into a very interesting and lively discussion. And I mentioned that when you're writing a paper in philosophy, your language cannot be too flowery, right? It cannot be ornate. It has to be direct, matter of fact. And that goes back to a long tradition in philosophy. And a clear distinction is made very often between literature and philosophy. And Derrida is saying, no, there really is no difference between literature and philosophy, because ultimately they are all metaphorical. But we can go right back to Plato. Plato, in his Republic, banished all poets from his ideal state. He said, I do not want any poets in my ideal state. Right? That ideal state is a state in which we're going to use logic and dialectic to arrive at an understanding of truth. After a number of years through the mastery of mathematics, we'll know what truths are. We do not want the meddling or the interference of poets in our state, because they say things metaphorically that is open to all kinds of interpretations. Very often they resort to mythos instead of logos, to myth instead of logic, and therefore their presence in the state and their very bad influence will vitiate efforts at building a true civilization and creating conditions for human flourishing. Aristotle did not go down that path. Aristotle was prepared to accommodate poets in his state, but he made a clear distinction between logic on the one hand and rhetoric on the other. Right? Rhetoric is what in your own context, right? As people who are preparing to preach, right, to convince others, this is applicable both to law as well as to preaching, right, and evangelism. Your language has to be persuasive. It has to catch people's attention. And therefore, you have to use a number of rhetorical devices in order to achieve that goal. Philosophy rejects that completely. Philosophy is logic. So Aristotle wrote a very significant book on logic. Remember the prior analytics and the posterior analytics. And then he wrote a book on rhetoric, pointing out all of those devices. That is in the realm of poetry. And when you come down through the ages, we see that there has always been that clear and separate division between poetry on the one hand and philosophy on the other. And the very powerful and disturbing critique of Derrida is that really and truly they are the same, because all language is metaphor. And even though philosophy attempts to use language in its purest, most logical form, it cannot avoid metaphor. And if all language is metaphor, it means that language fails to capture reality as it is. And as philosophy has taught us in the past that it was able to do, right? It fails to capture reality. That language as metaphor means that language is a screen that prevents us from penetrating the world of reality. He talks about language as a screen. Language blinds us to a perception of reality. Now, this is an extremely powerful critique of language, right? He is moving beyond, right? And people like Noam Chomsky and other linguists. Noam Chomsky made a tremendous contribution to language, where he was able to explain language in Kantian terms as having deep underlying structures that reflect the structures of mind and world. Derrida is rejecting that concept of language. Language is a system of difference, and it's structured on metaphor, and the metaphoricity of language makes language virtually, makes philosophy and literature virtually indistinguishable. And the other features of that linguistic mode that Derrida is very much concerned about. When he examines the language of the West, when he examines human language generally, he is seeing a number of problems with that language. Certain kinds of prejudices, the privileging of certain concepts over other concepts. He rejects what he calls the celebration of logos or reason, right, in our linguistic structures. He calls that logocentrism, the centering of the logos, the centering of reason. He says that very often, when we try to communicate and to express meaning, we privilege the logical, right, over all other aspects of language or other aspects of human communication, right? And that is wrong, because language does not only communicate that which is logical, it communicates that which is illogical. It communicates feeling and emotion and hurt and pain and so on. So that the privileging of logos really falsifies essentially what we consider to be true meaning, right? To be the semantic content of a particular phrase or proposition or passage. And then there is also within that structure of language, the privileging of maleness. And he calls that phallocentrism. Phallo is from the word phallus. And the word phallus is a technical term that refers to the penis, right? We always talk as if males are superior to females. That which is male is over and against and above that which is female. We talk in patriarchal terms. The whole world is structured in patriarchal terms. And very often, or even more technologies are created, right? Which privileges the male, which enhances male use, which is oriented to male use. I remember looking at a truck once and looking at the steps to go into the truck and wondering how women would be able to get into that truck and drive it. Even our technologies are predisposed, right, and towards male usage. I don't think that is so any longer. I think that to a large extent, people have taken into account the presence of the female and the rise of the female and the accessibility to all areas of human culture and human tech and contemporary technologies. But there's that phallocentrism, that patriarchal, dominating patriarchal worldview and system of values that characterizes our speech. And then he talks about something called phonocentrism, the centering of speech over language, the elevation of speech over language. We talk as if speech over writing, right? We talk as if speech is more significant than writing. And when Derrida talks about writing, he's really talking about language and the permanent structures that language possesses. Speech is really a particular autonomous and single usage of what essentially exists as a body, a system, a structure that is permanent and very often quite inflexible, right? So he talks about this, the privileging of speech over language, and a lot of his philosophy is really oriented towards that notion. Derrida is known, in fact, what made Derrida famous is his system of what is called deconstruction. That was a new word, right? Derrida had sort of, well, he hadn't coined it, he had gotten it from one of his predecessors, philosophical predecessors. But I think even in Hegel, we find the word deconstruction. But for Derrida, it was a new system of textual interpretation, right? I mean, he said the text must be not just critiqued. And that would have been the word that had been familiar to most people. You take a text and you examine the text. You develop a hermeneutic, or you develop exegetical patterns and techniques for an examination of the text. You want to understand the text. You want to get the meaning of the text. You need to get the intention of the author. What is the author trying to say in this text, right? You look for the logical consistency or development of ideas in the text. That has been the traditional way of viewing a text. Literary criticism, with its various modalities of textual interpretation, generally been oriented to that kind of textual understanding and interpretation. Derrida comes up with a radically different notion. He says texts must not just be critiqued, they must be deconstructed. And by deconstruction, he's really talking about a certain kind of destruction. The text is not really destroyed, but the text is pulled apart. And what we search for in the text are inherent contradictions in the text. He's saying every text really is flawed by a range of contradictions. And he's not only talking about massive texts, philosophical systems, and so on. He's even talking about a single literary text, a single book. If you read any document, you're going to find that the author is always contradicting himself, that there is always a notion that goes against another notion, right? And that system of that body of contradictions needs to be unearthed by the inquirer, by the literary critic, by the philosopher who is examining that text. And you find it not only in works of literature, you also find it in works of philosophy, right? One of the problems, for example, in the text is that we give preeminence to presence over absence, right? We are concerned only with presence, or primarily with presence, and not concerned with absence. But when you read any text, you are simultaneously finding the coexistence of presence and absence. And that's a strange notion, right? And what he's hinting at is the fact that texts not only state propositions, but there are also implications derived from those propositions that points to systems, to realities, to conditions that are not contained in the text, right? I may make a statement, for example. I may make a statement. Let's say I make a statement in theology. I say that God is a great God, and that I can see in my own experience, even today, that he has saved me. Now, what I'm saying here and what is present is a notion of God saving me. But what is absent, what I do not say, but what that points to is a whole body of ideas contained in the Christian tradition. Right? The notion of Christ coming to die for man, the notion of accepting Christ, as the Son of God, and accepting the Trinitarian view. All of these things are hinted at, are suggested, but they are absent from the text. And if I have to understand the text, I have really to understand the text, not only in terms of what is present in the writing before me, but I have to understand the text in terms of the hints, the references to that which is not within the text, but which is so very important to understand the text. Right? So he's talking about that relationship between presence and absence. When you read the literature of many of the, within the whole Western philosophical tradition, starting from Plato, coming down to people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they always gave preeminence to what is spoken over against what is written. And there are obvious reasons for it. The spoken very often takes place in the present. And therefore, when somebody is speaking and you are listening to them, you are capturing meanings that relate to what is considered to be the reality of the present. In addition to that, speech is able to communicate meaning through intonation. You can support a statement with gesture. You use your hands and so on in order to make the point that you want to emphasize within that context, within that proposition, right? So that clearly what we are finding is that speech has a certain range and flexibility that writing can never have. But Derrida is saying that's unfair to writing, because one of the things that writing does is that it in a way immortalizes speech. It makes it permanent, right? You can always refer to the writing thereafter. Speech is lost, right? The spoken word escapes and never returns. It is only now with our modern technologies that the spoken word can be retained. An example being what is happening here. I'm speaking, and you can look at it after. But essentially, and Derrida would refer to this as a certain kind of writing, right? So the privileging of speech over writing is something that Derrida bemoans, and he believes that one should see those two dimensions of language on an even plane. So deconstruction is certainly one that refuses to give a certain priority or preeminence to speech over writing. And then they are very often, when people are developing a point, they reach an intellectual and philosophical impasse, right? They can't go any further. He calls that an aporia, A-P-O-R-I-A, right? The adjective from that is aporetic. When you look at the text, very often there are a number of aporias in that text. And the task of the critic, the task of the philosopher in interpreting the text is to identify those aporia, right? Those instances when there is a termination of a sequence of rational, logical arguments, and a terminal that does not bring a resolution to the problem that is addressed. Right? So deconstruction became extremely popular in Western European literature, and literary critics, for example, people in the humanities began now to use it as a technique of interpretation, right? Identifying contradictions. Biblical scholars, for example, use deconstruction to interpret a number of biblical texts, biblical writers, where there were evidence of some kind of contradiction in the text. It's become extremely popular. Derrida believed that the text is ultimately the ground on which we must be able to establish meaning. And one of the things that he argued is that even though we talked about presence and absence, and the fact that the text always hints at that which is not contained in the text itself, but belongs to a body of ideas that exists out there, he felt that when we are interpreting a text, we must look at its context, the context of the text. Remember, we talked about Hegel's insistence on historical consciousness. And historical consciousness insists that the notion of historical consciousness insists that we must look at the historical context of any given event, right, in human experience or human history. He's talking about the actual text that we're looking at, that it is unfair, really, to take notions that have no necessary relationship with the text and bring them to an interpretation of the text. And when we are interpreting the text, even though we recognize the coexistence of presence and absence, we must not import extraneous material or data into our interpretation of the text. He says in French, there is nothing, rien, or the text. Il n'y a rien, or the text. There is nothing outside of the text, right? And that insistence on examining the text as it exists is a very important one, and again, it's used by a number of scholars to interpret and to understand literature, writing, and when we talk about text, we very often the reference is not only to that which is written, but we can talk about text in terms of culture. We can talk about the text or the textuality, say, of the Carnival event or of the Christmas celebration. We can talk about that as consisting of a text, right? So text is not only confined to the it's not only confined to literature. The next writer of importance, perhaps of equal importance, is Jacques Derrida, is Michel Foucault. And Michel Foucault was really very, very different than Derrida. When you read Derrida and Foucault, you wonder whether you're still reading philosophy sometimes. Their language is strange. It's very often extremely obscure in certain instances. They take sometimes something that seems to be a very irrelevant notion and they blow it up into the center of their philosophical investigations and so on. Michel Foucault is very Nietzschean, right? In a way, Nietzsche became alive once more in Foucault's writings. And I think where they correspond very, very much is in their amalgamation of knowledge and power. Nietzsche gave us the notion and the insight into knowledge as a body, a system of concepts and so on, that is always contaminated by a lust for power, a lure for power. And we talk about the will to power, and that will to power dominates all areas of human activity. Foucault is not talking about the will to power in the same metaphysical way in which Nietzsche identifies the will to power as central to human existence. But what Foucault is saying is that knowledge itself, all bodies of knowledge, contain a certain measure of power. We always try to convince other people that what we believe and what we say is correct. And we suggest that they should replace their own system of ideas by what we present to them, right? The relationship between teacher and student, for example, defines that. You know, even the way in which I've structured the course does suggest that I have determined, I didn't engage in a democratic exercise with the class to determine what orientation should be taken as we are doing this course in philosophy at University of the Southern Caribbean. I made the decision myself, and in a way I'm imposing my view of philosophy on the class. Now what one hopes would happen is not only would the class listen to it and to some extent accommodate themselves to that notion, but begin to interrogate that notion and to move away from that when they have gained a certain kind of intellectual maturity. Right, so I can even demonstrate how power exists in almost all situations. The preacher stands on the podium, and in the church setting, it's not like a Sabbath school class. In the church setting, what he does is that he merely pontificates to the audience, expecting that everything he says the audience will accept, especially after he invites the Holy Spirit to guide him. You are expected to accept everything he says as truth. That is a manifestation of power, right? In a courthouse, you find that there's a struggle for power between defense, right? The defense lawyers and so on, and those who are issuing the charges, right? The prosecution. So it's always a power play, and it is the outcome is determined by who eventually gains, you know, the ascendancy. Right. So that knowledge always is orchestrated by, right? It is penetrated by a lust for power and the attempt to gain domination, right, over people. And Foucault refers to a certain kind of structure that characterizes almost all institutions that he calls a panopticon. Panopticon, the panopticon. He said that when you look at the structure of most institutions, if you wish, both at the physical level and at the structural level, you would find that they have, the pattern is essentially that of the panopticon. The panopticon is supposed to be an architecture in which power is centralized at a particular point that allows the controller, that allows the manager, that allows the leader to be able to see what is happening in all parts of his organization. I remember when I was in the secondary school system in the 1980s and 90s, and they were building new schools. They tried to build new schools in such a way that the principal's office was central. Previously, they built it in such a way the principal's office faced the road. So as soon as you came in, you saw the principal, and then you were able to get to the rest of the school. And now they began to build it with a certain centrality, architectural centrality. So the principal could sit in his office, look through his window, and see almost all the buildings in the school and get an idea of what was happening. And then he would have his microphone to speak to the entire school, right? The panopticon, he could view, he could call a student out from any class to the principal's office. That structure is a structure characteristic of almost all physical institutions. And it centralizes power in one place, in one person. It's not oriented to the equitable distribution of power, right? So that power becomes very important in our system of things, in our culture. And Foucault sets out to examine how power operates, and very often how very damaging and devastating power can be to the well-being of human beings. He's written a number of other books called The Birth of the Clinic. And it's a very similar kind of discipline and punish, right? How schools are structured in that, and hospitals are structured in that, and prisons are structured in that, and armed forces are structured in that. That notion of discipline and punish. In order for people to be disciplined, there's a need for punishment. I talked about that before when I was talking about the dominant pedagogical principles that existed in Western educational systems for a long time. When people got things wrong, you beat them, right? And the next time they would remember the licks and therefore make sure that the answers were right. So Foucault's analysis is an analysis that clearly interrogates the structures of our contemporary civilization and shows how flawed they are. Another very interesting book he wrote was a book called Madness and Civilization. And there is where he deals with the problem of logocentrism, the centering of logos, of logic, of reason. He says that when you look at human civilization, we marginalize madness and we centralize reason. But again, a better understanding of human civilization, we need to look at the interplay of madness and civilization, right? That interplay between reason on the one hand and unreason on the other, because a lot of human activity is characterized not just by reason, but by unreason. And he's not just talking about the problem of feeling and emotion, especially the negative feelings and emotions, but he's also talking about the problem of contradictions, right? That our marginalization of madness gives us a distorted view of the structures. And again, I made reference to it in a different context, but just look at the whole question of Trinidad Carnival, right? Trinidad Carnival is seen as the primary expression of the zeitgeist of the Trinidadian, of the time spirit of the Trinidadian. Our soul is expressed in the Carnival. And we have produced such masters in the realm as Peter Minshall and others, the Mighty Sparrow, right? These people capture and embody the values of our culture. Carnival is also referred to as the reign of the merry monarch, right? It's a time of madness, right? The actual motility on the streets is an indication as to what extent the reason has been abandoned and madness takes over. We lose our reason for 2 days. And that is not the only feature. We see it in the political realm. We see it when we listen to debates in parliament, we see that melding, right, of reason and unreason, a powerful argument and ridiculous response very often within those situations of political debate, discussions of economic affairs and so on. So that madness, the marginalization of madness, has led us to a fairly distorted concept of really what constitutes human culture. And the 2 last points about Foucault are also very important. Foucault sees language in a slightly different way than Derrida, but they both see language as screening reality from us. It hides reality, it conceals it. Reality is hidden by the use of language. And for Foucault, it is not about metaphor. Foucault argues that all our formations are linguistic formations. All our systems and bodies of ideas are only putting language together in a structured manner. He calls them discursive formations. Our civilization is created by discourse. And even our technologies are created by discourse. Our interactions are created by discourse. Our institutions, the family institution and so on, all created by discourse. Our church and our theologies are created by discourse. And therefore, for Foucault, our whole system of culture, right, essentially is the creation of discursive formations or linguistic formations. And that in itself traps us in a certain kind of predicament from which we cannot extricate ourselves. We can never gain contact with things in themselves, with the world as it really is, because we are so entangled, right, by the network of language within which we live. And finally, Foucault declares, he talks about in that context also, the concept of the episteme, right, the worldview. Sometimes it's pronounced episteme, right, the episteme, the worldview. Our worldviews are all entangled in language. And it is very important to recognize how those worldviews shape our behaviors and shape our reality. And finally, the notion of the death of man, which derives from Nietzsche again, but what Foucault is pointing us to is a point where humanism no longer seems to be the rational way in which we can understand human life. It's the end of humanism. It announces the end of humanism. The end of the human, the death of man, really signifies the end of humanism. And we are in a position in space and time where everything seems to point beyond the human. Remember that Nietzsche talked about the Superman. It is now in this age that we can really talk seriously about the Superman, especially with the benefits that we have derived, or the inventions of the 4th Industrial Revolution, artificial intelligence, machine learning, right? All of these things are clearly indications that man is moving beyond the human, that we are now availing ourselves of capacities and potencies which makes us more than human, right? So there's and then there are all kinds of prosthetics that we can apply to our bodies. You see it very often in those science movies, the Terminator and so on, where people become cyborgs and they're machines, and that is physically possible, where they're machines that extend their basic physical powers, their power to run, their power to knock down somebody, right? Their power to solve many of the problems that the science fiction stories set out to portray, right? And then there's another dimension of the post-human that we have got to take into account. We live in an age of ecological disaster. Everything is perishing around us, and we are the architects of that disaster. Species are wiped out by big, powerful species, whales, hunting merely for their oil and their flesh, right? Elephants for their tusk. This is horrendous. And this is because of humanism. This is because we centered humanity as the ultimate meaning of human life and the universe. And we have got to move beyond humanism, right, to a certain kind of speciesism. What is important is species, not the human species alone, but all the species are important. We all belong to a network, right, within the biosphere where we share, right, certain aspects of our existence and where we are interdependent for our existence. We are all interdependent on each other's species for existence. I mean, we human beings are dependent on microorganisms, right? We're dependent on bacteria and viruses in order to survive. And so we must recognize the place that these species have and not see them as enemy or see them as food and so on, but see them as fellows, co-travelers in this journey of life, people with whom we have to share the planet. And the last thinker that I want to mention is Jean-Francois Lyotard. And Lyotard is written a number of books also, but there are certain phrases that I think he has made very popular, right, in contemporary philosophical discourse. When Lyotard looks at our civilization, he sees a number of systems and bodies of ideas. There's Christianity and its whole story of salvation. There's Marxism and its whole account of how the world ought to be organized economically and how we can bring about a change in human being, human nature, and human society by radically changing our economic relations and the forces of production. There's liberal democracy, on the other hand, which claims that freedom is all and people must enjoy freedom of speech and freedom of movement and so on. Right? When we look at the whole sphere of the intellectual world, of the cultural world, we see these large bodies of ideas which come to dominate human thinking. And he calls these stories, narratives. And his term for them is that they are meta-narratives or mega-narratives. These mega meaning large, meta meaning beyond. Right? These meta-narratives and mega-narratives are what we are induced into. We come to accept, we get assimilated into. But we must all, as individuals who respect the autonomy of the individual, we must all adopt an incredulity towards meta-narratives. We must begin to disbelieve them. We must not readily accept them, right? And therefore he advocates what he calls an incredulity towards meta-narratives. And the fact that perhaps you can even use Derridian deconstruction to deconstruct these meta-narratives and see, as Foucault has pointed out, that they are merely implements and tools that are used by people to exercise power over the human mind and the human imagination. He talks about a hermeneutics of suspicion, another term that becomes very popular in contemporary intellectual discourse, a hermeneutics of suspicion, where when you approach a body of ideas, you do not approach it with credulity. Credulity meaning belief. You don't say, well, I'm hearing something now and I must listen to it and appropriate and assimilate and believe it. I must be very suspicious of it. I must suspect that it is advanced and presented to me so as to capture my own imagination, so as to control me, so as to allow some other agency to exercise power over me. And so that hermeneutics of suspicion has become very characteristic of very many areas of contemporary philosophical thinking. So that, you know, post-modernity or post-modernism has really given us a radically different view of the world as it exists. As I said, some people see it as coming after the Enlightenment period and modernism. Some people see it as another dimension of modernism. Notice what happened with language when we looked at Wittgenstein and we saw what Wittgenstein said about language. Notice how language is now transformed. The Wittgensteinian notion of language is developed and transformed by people like Derrida and later by Foucault and taken to other extremes, right? So that you can also see postmodernism as a further development of the modernist concept, but one which takes us into a different direction. A number of other authors, people like Derrida and so on, but I think that presenting you with these three postmodernist thinkers gives you a real insight into the nature of postmodernism. And I imagine that you're going to follow this up as you continue your reading after this course has ended.